Good afternoon. For the last 35 years, I have been teaching at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I've been teaching a course in social ethics, the ethics of public policy making, or sometimes the lack thereof. And most of the students that I get are new to public health. Most of them are working towards a master's in public health. And so we start with the question of what is public health, which probably for a general audience is a decent place to start. So we're talking about a place, not a profession, but a place where scientists and social movements get together for the goal of preventing death at too young an age and eliminating unnecessary suffering. And each semester, I start a conversation with the students by asking them, why are they doing that? What is their motivation? Why are they in public health? First off, I want to make sure that they aren't under the illusion that they're in public health for the big bucks, because that is definitely not the case. What it boils down to, as the conversation goes on, is that we're doing this because of our urge to care for the other. But this turns out to be a complex issue because the other is a complex concept. So I would argue that there are at least two dimensions for the other. One is whether the person is real to you or an abstraction, and the other is whether or not you're related or you're unrelated. So you can see it's a 2x2 table. Every professor at a school of public health has to put everything into a 2x2 table. It's in our contracts. And so you can get real related. For instance, my children. These are my children. This was taken on the day when they all three discovered that even though they were living 1,000 miles apart, they had all bought exactly the same pair of glasses. And I said, you know, you guys are like a fashion show. And so this is, they were voguing for me. Another example, if somebody is a clinician, then the real and related are their patients. Okay, these are people that are real, you can poke them, and you have a relationship to them, and you completely understand what your relationship is. One of the other cells is abstract but related. So these are people or groups of people that you're related to, but they're an abstraction. You can't poke them. So for me, a good example of that is my ethnic group, Jews. Another example might be my children's unborn children. Okay, at the moment, I don't have any grandchildren, but I'm related to the idea that I will have posterity, that I will have descendants. Okay, it's an abstraction, but I'm completely related to it. So much so that I embarrass my children. Then there are the real and unrelated, and you see these people every day of your life. These are people who are absolutely real. You could walk over and tap them on the shoulder, but you have no idea what your relationship is to these people. Okay? These may be people who could be your best friends if you got to know them, or they could be a terrible person you don't know. So somebody who's stranded on the side of the road, or somebody who's a beggar. These are real but unrelated others. A perfect example of this is Wesley Autry, who a few years ago saw a young white man standing on the subway platform in New York, and this young man fell into the tracks, and Wesley Autry, having no relationship to this person at all, jumped down and pressed his body down on the man's body as the train rolled over them. Just a classic example of caring for the real but unrelated other. The hardest group to care for is that fourth cell, which is the abstract and unrelated other. This, in public health, I refer to this as the truly other. I started my career as a lobbyist for environmental groups, and I would go out and I would say, we need clean air. And the question is, for whom? Because I never met anybody who ever came up to me and said, you know, I liked your work at the Lung Association. Thank you very much for doing that. Because it was all completely the truly other. One of the things that makes working in public health a noble activity is that we pick for ourselves that. Because we don't know exactly who it is that we're helping. But we have the moral imagination to spread from these drunken revelers in New Orleans. We have the moral imagination that says we care for these people. Even though we don't know who they are, we're not related to them. We care for these people. It's easy to care for the real and related. Everybody cares for the real and related others in their lives. And most of us find the moral imagination, stretch their moral imagination over the real, over the abstract and related. It gets harder to find the moral imagination to care for the real but unrelated. And it takes a great deal of moral imagination to care for the abstract and unrelated. So I always imagined this guy out in the suburbs of Chicago who has no interest in infant mortality on the west side of the city. He doesn't care about it. If there are a lot of little black kids who don't live to the age of 1, it's just not inside the frontiers of his moral imagination. But this is a really good man. He cares for his family. He's a great neighbor. He's an active participant in his church. You know, for everything that we judge, this is a caring individual. It's just that the frontiers of his moral imagination are limited. And then these people turn into these people after Katrina. And this guy who would never think to focus on infant mortality on the west side of the city, he goes and he rents a big old truck and he drives up and down his neighborhood collecting clothing and drives 1,000 miles to New Orleans to distribute this clothing for free. Because these people got inside his moral imagination. So one of the things that I'm arguing is that we need to find ways to stretch people's moral imagination, to find in their own experiences, their relationships to these more attenuated others. And one of the ways that is easy to do that is through narrative. We just saw this recently when the Newtown parents went to Congress and sat there and told about the children that they'd lost. It's impossible not to let that into your moral imagination. So if I may, I'm going to give you a narrative. I'm going to tell you the story about my parents. So you saw the picture of my kids. Those are 2 of them. This was before the 3rd one was even born. So this is an old picture. And that's my father in the middle. If I may, I'm going to tell you his story twice. First in portrait, and then, with your permission, I'm going to tell you the same story, but in landscape the second time. So my father was born in Odessa, Russia. And his father was a Polish Jew, and he was a business person working in Odessa. And when the Russian Revolution came along, the family had to leave. It was not a good place to be a Jewish business person. So they were on their way back to Warsaw. And they were stopped by a couple of Soviet soldiers who proceeded to take everything they had and then started talking about how they would kill them. And my father, my 3-year-old father, stood up and wagged his fingers at the soldiers and said, "You can't kill my family." And the soldiers laughed and said, "Okay, get out of here." And so my father and his parents and his sister made it back to Warsaw, where they had plenty of money, and actually my father lived a very comfortable life. He was actually a bit of a dilettante. He didn't have a job. He had no profession, no sense of the future. He was just sort of living a pleasant life in Warsaw. Until September 1st of 1939, when Hitler crossed the frontier into Poland. and my father walked east out of town. And on the way out of town, walking, he ran into his father, my grandfather. And that's when he realized that my grandmother had not made it out. She was still in Warsaw, Nazi-occupied Warsaw, as the ghetto was being formed. My father walked back into Warsaw. He was blonde and blue-eyed. It's hard to tell from this picture. My grandmother was blonde and blue-eyed. He found her passing, being taken care of by a Catholic family who was taking care of her. It took him a couple of weeks staying with this family before they got out of Warsaw again, and they found their way to Lithuania, where they got matched up again with my grandfather. There were tens of thousands of Jews in Lithuania, and many of them got out by getting a visa to go to Japan and then a travel visa to go to Curacao, which is a little Dutch colony in the Caribbean. So my father and his family traipsed across Siberia and ended up many, many months later, and actually they ended up in Kobe, Japan on December 8th, 1941, which, if you account for the international dateline, is Pearl Harbor Day. So no Pearl Harbor, no Dan Schwartzman. Because he would have gotten a visa to the United States and never met my mother. But in fact, he ended up having to go to Shanghai, China, because that's the only place that he could go. They didn't have travel papers. And lo and behold, he found a job. And he turned out to be really good at it. He was a salesperson. And he was terrific as a salesperson. Around the corner from the store that he worked at was a little cafeteria called the Malinki Cafe, which in Russian means little cafe. And that was run by my mother. My father used to say that my mother gave him free cream puffs. My mother denied this completely. They got married. He adopted my mother's child from her first marriage. They had a daughter, my sister. And by 1947, they were ready to come to the United States. They arrived in the United States with $700 worth of hairnets. So basically, they had two little kids and no money. My father, a salesperson, spoke no English and had to find a job. So he went up to Seattle, Washington, and he started loading and unloading boats. He was a longshoreman. My mother and my siblings were still in San Francisco, and then months later they came up and joined him. After a while, he learned enough English to get a job as a salesperson, and by the way, to beat me at every game of Scrabble I ever played with him, even after I went to law school. I'm still not over that irritation. Actually got very successful, and from working class got to middle class, and then got just at the upper layers of middle class and the lower layer of upper middle class. Had a nice house, had 3 kids who did exceptionally well. My brother never went to college, but turns out is an electronics genius and has 3 patents and ended up with his own computer company and retired a few years ago, very well off. My sister, the first of our family to go to college, actually ended up at Brown University on a full ride scholarship, 4 years, no pay. I went to the most expensive law school in the country, and I thought that my parents had figured out a way to pay for this. My sister retired a couple of years ago, and she's also very well off. Me, not so much. One of the central ironies of teaching college is that you can't afford to send your children there. But I've done fairly well, okay? I've done fairly well. And you could not tell my father that the American dream didn't exist because he'd lived it. He'd come here penniless and had 3 kids who went to Ivy League schools and owned patents and retired very comfortably. So that's the story, that the way we normally hear it in portrait. If I may, I want to go back and I want to tell you the story in landscape, because you didn't hear all the facts. I mean, you go back to those 2 Russian soldiers who let my father and his family go. If they didn't have enough humanity to see the humor in my father's 3-year-old bravado, they would have been killed, just like many tens of thousands of Jews were killed in the Soviet Union, and nobody would have heard from them again. They got back to Warsaw, and after fleeing, my father walks back into Warsaw, and he finds my grandmother staying with Gentile friends. Those Catholic Poles were taking their lives into their hands by having my grandmother and then my father stay with them. If the Nazis, who had occupied Warsaw by this point, had found out that they were harboring Jews, the entire family would have lost everything, their lives and their whole futures. My father got sick on the way to Lithuania, and he had to stop in at a farmhouse where the farmer and his wife took care of my father and nursed him back to health. In fact, at one point, Nazis came to the door, and the farmer, they said, "Do you have any Jews here?" And the farmer said, "Well, no, we don't." And they said, "Can we look in?" I said, "Sure, look around, it's fine, but I don't know that you want to go into that room because that's my cousin, and he's got typhus." This couple risked their lives for my father and my grandmother, told lies to professional killers. When my father gets to Lithuania, I'd always wondered as a kid, why Japan and why Curacao? Well, it turns out that there was a Japanese diplomat in Lithuania, a guy named Chiyune Sugihara. Many people think of him as the Japanese Schindler, because he saw these Jews piling up, and he said, "We have to do something for these people." His people in Japan said, "No, we're not going to let you." So, against orders, he wrote over 2,000 visas for my parents, my father, my grandparents, and 2,000 other Jews. I'd always wondered if this was my family's story. When I was at the Holocaust Museum many, many years ago, I asked whether they had a list of the people that Sugihara saved. They handed it to me. I saw my father's name and my grandparents' name, Josef Schwarzman, Golda Schwarzman, Alexander Schwarzman. And I just started crying. I couldn't stop myself. I was uncontrollably weeping. My father gets to Shanghai, no job. It turns out that there was a large Jewish population in Shanghai who had come from the Middle East 60 or 70 years ago, and they were rich. They could have seen the 20,000 Eastern European Jews who had come there as riffraff. But in fact, they decided these were their landsmen, these were their people. And they took care of them, and they took care of my father and my grandparents. It was Jewish organizations that paid for my parents to come to the United States, and it was Jewish organizations that found the job in Seattle. They found a job in Houston, they found a job in Seattle. I almost grew up in Houston. My father found a job with this wonderful family, the Wachters, who gave him a job, and they were so happy with his work that they promoted him over the sons that they had working in the business. When my father moved to Chicago, the people that he sold to would send their grown children to Chicago just to see that Alex Schwartzman was okay. I found out, that the reason why my brother succeeded is because the company he worked for looked past the fact that he didn't have a college degree, looked past the fact that he spoke in double negatives, and realized he was brilliant. And that they gave him the opportunity to have those patents. My sister went to Brown University on a full-ride scholarship because generations of people have been contributing to Brown University so that they have the money to give to a shy but hardworking and smart immigrant kid to come to an Ivy League school. I said I went to the most expensive law school in the United States. And I always wondered how my parents afforded it. I found out about 12 years ago they didn't. That Ray and Jeanette Wachter, my parents' boss, my father's boss, they paid for my college education. They paid for my law school education. That caring, that moral imagination is the reason why I am who I am where I am, the reason why I'm standing here today, the reason why I've had the luxury of studying this and being able to put some of these ideas together. We need to tell our family stories twice. Everybody's family story in this room is worth telling twice. I don't care if you came over on the boat, or if your parents came over the boat, or if the boat your parents came over was the Mayflower. Everybody's family stories can be told in portrait and landscape. And what you do is you find the moral imagination, the communities, the geographic and the historic communities whose moral imagination, whose caring is the reason why you are who you are, where you are, and what you're doing. And when we do that, when we stimulate people's attention to moral imagination, we realize that we're all inevitably embedded in community. That the most libertarian of us is living an illusion. That we are all, when we tell our stories twice, and we make sure we tell it in landscape, we find out that we're all embedded in community. And ultimately, this allows us to generate and to mobilize moral imagination, because that's what will cause generations of people to care for not just the real and related other, but all those other more complicated others that they have to care for. And ultimately, we can then stand and say, we need to have leadership on behalf of that community that we're all embedded in. Thank you.